I just thought, those of you that do follow ASEAN will know that there is a very broad mix of opinions between analysts. And this is actually just a little take from just the last few months of various newspaper articles, a lot of which are from regional papers, and I just added a few from Australia just to be balanced towards the bottom there. But you can see it's quite polarised. Perhaps I had a professor in my masters who used to say where we sit determines what we see. Maybe this can be explained by some people assessing, say, recent joint statements, communiques coming out of ASEAN on the basis of, well, this is relatively strong compared to the past quarter century of dealing with the South China Sea. And then there are others that are saying, or looking at it from the perspective of, well, what needs to take place in order to actually have a constructive, tangible impact. Because at the end of the day, what is happening is China is progressing forward. And that's really the basic reality. And nothing within ASEAN, or perhaps more broadly, has managed to interfere with that direction to date. So I guess that's my opening perspective in terms of where I sit and what I see. But nonetheless, the story with ASEAN is not one of constant bad news or constant good news. There's ebbs and flows in ASEAN unity, and ebbs and flows in terms of broader developments that have connected with ASEAN's role. So if we go back almost a quarter of a century ago, and when China passed a law on the South China Sea, ASEAN did quite quickly respond, albeit in ASEAN style without naming China specifically. And we saw a similar degree of consensus when the Philippines government released photographic imagery of China building installations on the Mischief Reef. So we had the Manila Declaration at the time. And as a part of these declarations, and particularly the latter one, a call for a code of conduct, also a call for all parties involved to be more actively engaged in international fora, such as, for example, the workshops led by Pak Hasjam Jalal in Indonesia. And so Indonesia has had a very long history in playing or attempting to play a constructive role. But also linked to back in 1992, ASEAN sought to strengthen its zone of peace, freedom and neutrality through the Southeast Asia nuclear weapons free zone. And that actually did have reference to continental shelves and EEZs, which also explains Beijing's resistance to it. But these factors, while they may have made a mark on China's assessment about ASEAN, that ASEAN could come together, that ASEAN could form a consensus, and perhaps it should view ASEAN in a different light, there were other factors beyond this at the time. So, for example, as we move past 1995, we see what's been referred to as the charm offensive by China, going through to the latter part of the 2000s, and a very strong or forward momentum in building up soft power and influence amongst the region. That was a part of that policy. But also in 1995, when China started to make or was seen to do the installations on Mischief Reef, we also have to recall that there had been a US withdrawal from the Philippines, and so that changed the strategic environment of the region. Then by 1998, we see a bit of a reversal of Filipino policy, new defence agreements, heightened or increased joint patrols. And so these factors, and I'm sure many others, flow in. The picture is always more than just one variable or another. It's quite nuanced, but all these things come together to create a picture of why we've had ebbs and flows also in Chinese positions and policies and ways of addressing the region, ASEAN, and the level of assertiveness or less assertiveness at different junctures. But, you know, a really key time was ASEAN's membership expansion, which coincided with the East Asian financial crisis and significant intra-ASEAN divisions, a change of leadership in not one but two countries, so President Suharto's New Order regime collapsing, and also the Thai Prime Minister resigning. So the kind of club of elite suddenly changed. And meanwhile, China didn't devalue its currency, which greatly reduced what could have been far more damage to regional economies. And that was one of many different sort of gestures over the years that followed that earned quite a bit of kudos within Southeast Asia vis-a-vis China. And so we suddenly start to see a shift with ASEAN membership and the problems of the financial crisis, the haze, etc., membership expansion to include Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, for example, it all of a sudden became a very different dynamic in terms of the capacity to get a consensus and which countries felt what kind of affinity with whoever else, be that the US or be that China. So we have this goal already stated back in the 90s to form a code of conduct. Nonetheless, ASEAN pushes forward with this, but then again we have divisions within ASEAN start to emerge for the reasons I've just outlined. And the most, I guess, well, in broad terms, Malaysia sided with China in wanting a less legalistic binding statement. So internal divisions undermine the idea of a code of conduct, and the compromise outcome was the 2002 Declaration of Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea. It's interesting if we have a look at the Chinese Foreign Ministry website that at the moment it serves their interest to refer to that as the binding Declaration of Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, because at the moment they want to say, for example, the Philippines is bound by the declaration to enter into bilateral negotiations with China. So we have a lot of half-truths by many countries on some of these issues. But it was a compromise agreement, and as with many compromises, it fell short of what was necessary to have an impact in preventing things going to the point that they have gone to today. For example, these confidence-building measures, there's not really been, in terms of the Declaration of Conduct of Party, tangible success in moving forward. In terms of the principles or guidelines, which are actually quite compatible with UNCLOS, we have not seen really the idea that countries should not act in a way that would undermine a possible peaceful settlement of the South China Sea dispute. Really, it's more notable for the extent to which those principles have been breached rather than adhered to. We see further deterioration in terms of ASEAN unity, partly because of loss of faith in the ASEAN role. So, for example, the Joint Marine Seismic Undertaking in certain areas of the South China Sea was joined initially between China and the Philippines, but also Vietnam joined in with that lack of trust, loss of faith in ASEAN in mind. It did fall apart. Reportedly, the Philippines agreed to 24,000 square kilometres of space that China had never previously actually claimed. So there's quite a significant domestic backlash over that agreement. From Beijing's perspective, despite its kind of limited collaboration with China, leading to the declaration of conduct, it really hadn't tangibly advanced its own interests. So we see a kind of, by 2005, really by 2007, another shift in the Chinese approach to become much more assertive, much more coercive, the sinking of Vietnamese fishing vessels, for example, and forcing the abandonment of a joint British-American Vietnam consortium from developing a gas field. On top of that, we have the global financial crisis, which also played in to the regional dynamics because it emboldened China. And we see academic literature, etc., talking about a harmonious East civilization. We also saw the notion and see the notion of the China dream. Some of the best experts on China, at least in my view, in their interpretation of Chinese documents, etc., interpret the view as a community of asymmetrical dependence. There is reciprocity, but if any country in this East Asian civilization acts in a way contrary to the interests of China, then there will be penalties, there will be sanctions. And we see that, for example, in the wake of the referral to the arbitration by the Philippines. Now, we also have a difference, and this is a challenge between ASEAN and China, in the preference for how to move forward, at least the rhetorical preference here. So ASEAN prefers to work simultaneously on, implementing the principles to the Declaration of Conduct on the South China Sea. China prefers, that's what China prefers, and ASEAN prefers to also simultaneously work on the Code of Conduct. China as well is against the idea that ASEAN can come to a collective position, and we see a reconceptualization really of past approaches through, in the last couple of years, reference to two-track diplomacy, that the bilateral issues should be handled bilaterally. So there's some contradictory statements here, and the vague statement that both China and ASEAN together are responsible for peace, security, stability in the region, which in reality is not exactly what we are seeing. But non-internationalization of dispute is also another thing. So the challenge here is it's quite dogmatic in its expectations of how, in this East Asian sort of civilization, countries should conform. So even meeting your requirement under international law by ratification of UNCLOS, such as a submission to the United Nations Commission on the limits of the continental shelf, is worthy of sanction. It is worthy of punishment under that rule because it goes against China's interests. So China reacts formally by lodging its 9-dash line, and then we see an action-reaction. You may remember the ASEAN Regional Forum, Hillary Clinton's comments. Then China escalates further, talking about this becoming a core interest, the South China Sea being elevated to a core interest. In 2011, with that background in mind, ASEAN does make another attempt to advance the Code of Conduct, but of course China says the time is not yet ripe, cited the behaviour such as the continental or the submission to UN, and lack of progress with the implementation of the guidelines to the Declaration of Conduct. However, very soon we see further escalation, and I'm sure most of you are aware of these incidents. So I'm just going to jump to the failure of the joint communique as being another key issue or challenge that ASEAN faced, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But importantly, in the wake of that, in January 2013, then the Philippines seeks arbitration. Now, that received mixed perceptions. I think it was actually a very positive development. All of a sudden, we see 3 months later the new Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, talking about, well, actually, we are willing to move on to the discussions for a code of conduct. But the problem was it was relegated to such a low level, not senior officials meeting, but working groups, track 2 dialogues, that no one had the authority to advance it. So, again, we have things go back and forth, but in 2014 there was the oil rig incident that's already been referenced, and of course what you all know about the island construction. Now, I mentioned Cambodia. One of the issues, and this has been repeated in the years since, is that China's economic influence, whether by trade, but the bigger story is investment, aid, etc., has had a very big impact on dividing ASEAN. So there were reports that the Cambodian Foreign Minister was consulting directly with Beijing, exiting the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting to consult on the text. Now, I've interviewed in Phnom Penh and some people exactly on this subject, an earlier project. Some people in the Council of Ministers, etc., said, well, of course, ASEAN doesn't look after our interests. China gives us more money. We are a poor country. So there wasn't even really a sense of shame. And perhaps in fairness to Cambodia, they look, and they do refer back to, for example, the incident over the Prey Vihir temple dispute, and they say, well, where was ASEAN there? When did the ASEAN states cover our back when Thailand, for many domestic purposes, took the action it did against Cambodia? So just in the final few slides, here we can see different economic dependencies. Malaysia, which may explain some of Malaysia's position, has far more exports than imports from China, so a positive trade balance, and Thailand is in the same position. It's important to point out that there's a lot of imports into Vietnam from China, but not so many exports. But the true picture, as I said, and it's beyond my presentation here, maybe at question time, is the investments. A country like Laos, with 6-7 billion GDP, it's a drop in the Chinese budget to have major impact on its policies. Also, and some of you have already seen this, but going back nearly 10 years ago, I did the first survey across the region of elite and also at the grassroots level, 100 at the elite. This one here is the grassroots, 819 in 7 languages. And you can see some issues in terms of some countries having trust of their neighbours as low as 15%. And this broadly coincided with what happened basically the end of the survey, and that was the Prey Vihir temple dispute. Overall, the elite, about 60%, don't trust their neighbours to be good neighbours. And also in terms of conflict, countries like Cambodia and Thailand, only 70% respectively, didn't believe that conflict between 2 or more ASEAN countries would be feasible within the next 2 years. This one, because of the response rate, I wouldn't look at the individual answers too much, but just the broad differentiation in terms of the mix of countries. 3 or 4 countries listing China in the top 3 strategic partners, 3 or 4 listing the United States. Sorry for those of us from Australia, only 1 listing us in the top 3, and that was Singapore, perhaps unsurprisingly. Finally, as my last point before conclusion, just want to highlight, I think political values do matter. For example, if you're a country that's more authoritarian and you have human rights issues, then it's much easier to get trade, investment, aid from, say, China. If you're a country that has made reforms, not necessarily a liberal multi-party democracy, but at least effective, efficient government, then you can also naturally get more assistance from the West. And with the money comes the strategic alignment. So I think broadly speaking, that's what we see in Southeast Asia. It seems self-explanatory, but it's something that's so strongly debated at a regional level. So in terms of retrospect and prospects, in terms of the risks, I would highlight, we talked about Donald Trump. Well, we have the Trump of the East, with all due respect, Philippines and President Duterte. I would be very interested to hear if maybe we can have an assessment of where things are going to look 2 years from now, and especially if, for example, under President Duterte, we have bilateral negotiations with China, when the Philippines has just come to a point where it's strengthened its position so much, and also talks about a new defence or even partnership with China and Russia at this point in time. Indonesia has been a shining light, and in many ways it still is, in terms of governance, but it seems to be losing its interest in ASEAN. We're not seeing the proactiveness that we saw under Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono or Marty Natalegawa. We have weakness in countries like Thailand and Malaysia, which is undermining things. And of course, Malaysia has its own trade dependencies with China. There's an overly cautious approach, I think. We talk about, well, this statement was made and that was relatively strong, but at the end of the day, if it doesn't actually shift behaviour, we need something stronger. So again, where we sit, I guess, determines what we see. And this is not just limited to ASEAN. I think everyone needs to take a stronger position, because China it's remarkable just how far it's progressed its interests in just the last couple of years. ASEAN unity does matter, but whether they can get that back again, there are ways, like an ASEAN minus X or something approach. But for example, Professor Thayer has a presentation on ASEAN more on the ways forward, and so I'll leave that to him there. The US presence has had a positive impact across the decades, and it's been a constraining one in terms of, say, Chinese behaviour. Legal arbitration has also had, I think, on balance, a positive impact. The question is just how much of an opportunity it will provide will be very much dependent on what is made from it over the coming months. And unfortunately, we've seen some developments in the last few weeks that seem to be almost like countries that are cutting off their nose in spite of their face. And that is quite alarming, and alarming, I think, for every other country represented here in this room. So thank you very much.